They were too fast, too loud, and too dangerous for their own good. These weren't just banned, they were buried. Built with insane power, reckless ambition, and zero concern for rules, these American machines scared regulators, terrified safety testers, and embarrassed the companies that made them. Some broke emissions laws, others broke bones, and a few were so uncontrollable they vanished almost overnight. These are the untouchables, 10 ultra-banned American cars that automakers never want you to remember. The Chevrolet Corvette XP882 is one of those fascinating what-if chapters in American automotive history, a secret glimpse at what might have been if GM had dared to unleash its full engineering potential in the early 1970s. It was a car that represented ambition without restraint, a bold experiment meant to challenge the Europeans at their own game and reclaim American dominance on the world's fastest tracks. But as with so many stories of speed and ego, it went too far, too fast. The XP882 wasn't just a prototype, it was a warning. It proved that even the mighty General Motors could build a car so powerful and so dangerous that it scared its own creators. In the late 1960s, Ford's GT40 had just humiliated Ferrari at Le Mans, and the racing world was changing. Aerodynamics, mid-engine layouts, and exotic materials were rewriting the rules of performance. Chevrolet's Corvette, while fast, was still a front-engine car, powerful but old-fashioned in the eyes of engineers who wanted to push boundaries. Zora Arkus Duntov, the legendary father of the Corvette, had long dreamed of creating a mid-engine variant to unlock the car's full handling potential. The XP882 was his moment. It was born in secret, a project that aimed to bring race car technology to the streets, a true American exotic before that word even existed in Detroit's vocabulary. The prototype was stunning, low-slung, wide, and impossibly sleek. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie rather than a GM design studio. Its mid-mounted V8 sat just behind the driver, giving it the ideal weight balance that Duntov believed the Corvette always needed. The car's experimental chassis and suspension geometry promised lightning-fast cornering, at least on paper. Underneath its futuristic fiberglass skin was an aluminum frame and an all-wheel drive system that was supposed to keep the car glued to the road. Engineers whispered that the XP882 could reach speeds of 200 miles per hour, which would have been one of the fastest cars on Earth at the time. But as soon as testing began, the dream turned into a nightmare. The suspension setup, radical and untested, made the car twitchy and unpredictable at high speeds. Small steering inputs could send it fishtailing across the track. Test drivers reported terrifying instability, especially under braking and during corner transitions. At over 150 miles per hour, the XP882 felt like it was trying to take off, and in 2 separate incidents, the car left the pavement and disintegrated in fiery crashes. Fortunately, the drivers survived, but the message was clear. The XP882 was a missile with no guidance system. GM executives were horrified. The late 1960s had already seen growing public concern over safety, pollution, and the recklessness of automakers. The Corvette XP882 was the exact kind of machine regulators were waiting to pounce on. An unstable, high-speed, mid-engine monster capable of killing even a professional driver. To make matters worse, insurance companies had begun cracking down on high-performance cars, penalizing automakers whose vehicles exceeded certain horsepower thresholds. If the XP882 ever made it to showrooms, GM feared it would spark a regulatory backlash and an avalanche of lawsuits. The car was immediately shelved. Engineers were ordered to destroy most of the prototypes, and Duntov was forced to watch his masterpiece vanish under corporate caution. GM publicly claimed that the XP882 was merely an engineering exercise, but insiders knew it was much more than that. It had been a near-production concept, a car that could have rewritten Corvette history decades before the modern C8. Duntov was devastated.
He had proved the GM could build a mid-engine supercar to rival the best from Europe, yet the company's fear of risk killed the project. When the oil crisis hit in 1973, it buried any remaining hope. GM turned its focus towards fuel economy and compliance, leaving the idea of a mid-engine Corvette to gather dust in locked archives. But the legend of the XP882 refused to die. It haunted Corvette enthusiasts for generations. Every few years, a rumor would surface that GM was reviving the idea. Whispers of new prototypes, new mid-engine designs, new chances to correct the past. Yet time and again, GM pulled back. The ghost of the XP882 hovered over every Corvette project for 50 years, its crashes still echoing in corporate memory. It became a symbol of what could have been. The American Ferrari that was too wild, too dangerous, and too far ahead of its time. When the mid-engine Corvette C8 finally arrived in 2020, it felt like the circle had finally closed. The C8 was everything the XP882 had promised. Balanced, controlled, stunningly fast, but safe and civilized. Engineers at GM quietly acknowledged the debt they owed to the old prototype, calling it the ancestor of the modern Corvette. One retired designer even said, "The XP882 scared us into building the car we should have built 50 years earlier." Today, the surviving XP882 prototypes are museum pieces, silent witnesses to one of GM's most ambitious and ill-fated experiments. To see one in person is to glimpse an alternate future, a world where America might have beaten Europe at its own supercar game long before Ferrari or Lamborghini became household names. It's hard not to imagine what might have been if GM had ignored its fears and pushed forward, refining the design instead of killing it. But perhaps it had to happen this way. The XP882 was too much, too soon. A flash of brilliance that burned too bright for its own time. In the end, the Corvette XP882 stands as a monument to the dangers of unrestrained power and the caution that often follows catastrophe. It was a car that terrified its own creators and changed the course of Corvette history. For half a century, it remained a whispered legend in GM's corridors, a reminder that some machines are simply too fast, too ambitious, and too unpredictable for the world they were born into.
The Ford Torino King Cobra of 1970 is one of those almost mythical machines that seems too extraordinary to have ever existed. It was born out of the wildest years of NASCAR, when Detroit's engineers were locked in a high-speed arms race that pushed both physics and sanity to their limits. The late 1960s saw the birth of the Aero Wars, a time when Ford, Dodge, and Plymouth transformed ordinary family cars into wind-cheating missiles that could break 200 miles per hour on the track. But while Dodge had its Charger Daytona and Plymouth its Superbird, Ford's ultimate weapon would come too late, too fast, too radical, and ultimately too banned. The Torino King Cobra wasn't just a car. It was Ford's final desperate lunge for dominance, a mechanical predator designed to kill everything in its path. The story begins in 1969 when the Dodge Charger Daytona made history as the first stock car to officially break 200 miles per hour at Talladega. NASCAR fans were stunned. The aerodynamic nose and massive wing of the Daytona, and later the Superbird, made the Mopar teams untouchable. Ford's engineers, humiliated and furious, retreated to their wind tunnels in Dearborn with a single mission: build something faster. What they created would be unlike any Ford ever built. Using the Torino Talladega as a base, they reshaped the body into something that looked more like a prototype racer than a production car. The front end was a sculpted wedge of fiberglass with a sloped nose and integrated headlights designed to slice through the air like a bullet. The lines were so smooth and alien that people who saw the prototypes joked that it looked ready to take off, and they weren't far from the truth. Under that slippery shell sat Ford's most fearsome engine, the 429 Boss V8. With hemispherical heads and race-ready internals, it could produce well over 600 horsepower in competition trim. On paper, the King Cobra could exceed 220 miles per hour, a figure that would have been unthinkable for a stock car at the time. Test drivers described it as ferocious, the kind of machine that made even professionals sweat. The power came on in a violent surge, the torque shoving the car forward like a jet launching off a carrier deck. On Ford's proving grounds, the King Cobra hit speeds that NASCAR officials were nervous long before it ever reached a race. The problem wasn't that it was too slow, it was that it was too fast. NASCAR's leadership had already begun worrying about safety. In 1970, the sport had seen horrific crashes, and the speeds of these new aero cars were becoming uncontrollable. When Ford unveiled the King Cobra, NASCAR officials immediately saw trouble. Here was a car that could destroy the competition, annihilate lap records, and possibly kill anyone reckless enough to race it. In their eyes, Ford had gone too far. The governing body responded by rewriting the rules, imposing engine displacement limits that made the 429 Boss illegal for use. They also set new homologation requirements that made it impossible for Ford to justify building enough King Cobras for competition. The message was clear. The car was banned before it even had a chance to race. Only 3 King Cobra prototypes were ever completed, each slightly different. One was powered by the monstrous 429 Boss engine, another by a tamer 429 Cobra jet, and the third used as a test mule. They were tested briefly at Ford's facilities in Michigan and at Atlanta Motor Speedway, where the car's brutal speed was confirmed and its instability at high velocity made itself known. Engineers reported front-end lift and steering twitchiness at more than 180 miles per hour, but they were confident they could fix it. NASCAR didn't give them the chance. When the ban came down, Ford pulled the plug immediately. Racing budgets were slashed, and with insurance and emissions crackdowns looming, Ford abandoned its high-performance programs almost overnight. The timing couldn't have been worse. The King Cobra was a technological marvel on the verge of greatness, but it arrived just as the golden age of horsepower was dying. As the oil crisis approached and safety regulations tightened up, cars like this became politically and financially toxic. Ford, which had once proudly ruled the track with the GT40 at Le Mans, was now turning its attention towards economy cars and emissions compliance. The King Cobra project was locked away, its prototypes quietly sold off or hidden in private collections. For decades, the existence of the King Cobra was little more than a rumor among collectors and racing historians. Photos were scarce, and Ford itself avoided talking about it, perhaps embarrassed that they built a car so extreme that it scared even NASCAR. Only in the 1990s did the few surviving cars begin to resurface. One of them, the orange prototype, originally used for aerodynamic testing, still wears its hand-formed fiberglass nose and unique grille with twin tunnel headlight openings, a shape that looks part shark, part fighter jet. When collectors and restorers saw it up close, they realized just how radical it really was. Every curve and line was sculpted purely for speed. It was a car built by engineers, not stylists, and it showed. Today, the Torino King Cobra stands as one of the rarest Fords ever made. Rarer even than the legendary GT40 or Boss 429 Mustang. Only 3 exist, each a tangible reminder of what happens when competition goes too far. It was banned not because it failed, but because it succeeded too completely. It was the pinnacle of Ford's racing ambition, a machine so advanced that the sport itself had to change the rules to contain it. When you see one today, preserved behind museum ropes or glinting under show lights, it's hard not to feel a shiver of awe. Its low, predatory stance still looks futuristic, its purpose still unmistakable. You can almost hear the growl of that 429 Boss echoing off the high-banked ovals it never got to conquer. It's the sound of a war that ended too soon, the roar of an era when engineers built cars that could defy the wind itself. The Ford Torino King Cobra wasn't just a car. It was the final defiant roar of the muscle age. It represented the absolute edge of what Detroit dared to build, a car that crossed from automotive engineering to aerospace ambition. And like so many great machines of that dangerous, beautiful time, it was silenced not by failure, but by fear. The 1975 Chevrolet Vega Cosworth was born from ambition, but it died from bureaucracy, bad timing, and betrayal. In the early 1970s, when American automakers were reeling from emissions restrictions, insurance crackdowns, and the fuel crisis, GM's engineers tried to prove they could still build something world-class, a compact, high-revving performance car that could stand beside the best from Europe. What they created should have been a triumph, a lightweight, twin-cam, fuel-injected machine developed in partnership with Britain's legendary Cosworth Engineering, the same company behind Formula One engines. On paper, the Cosworth Vega had everything: exotic technology, hand-built precision, and the promise of a new kind of American performance. But in practice, it became one of the most tragically flawed cars GM ever built, banned, detuned, and buried under the very regulations it was meant to conquer. The story began in 1971, when Chevrolet's engineers looked across the Atlantic and saw the success of cars like the BMW 2002 and Alfa Romeo GTV, small, agile, and refined sports sedans that American buyers were beginning to crave. GM wanted its own version, something that would combine European sophistication with American muscle. The base Vega, introduced in 1970, seemed like a starting point, a sleek little compact with aluminum construction and a modern unibody design. But the standard Vega was a disaster. It rusted almost instantly, its aluminum engine warped under heat, and its reliability was abysmal. So when Chevrolet announced a partnership with Cosworth to create a high-performance version, enthusiasts were hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, GM could redeem itself. The heart of the Cosworth Vega was its engine, a 122 cubic inch, 2-liter aluminum 4-cylinder fitted with a Cosworth-designed twin overhead camshaft head. Each unit was hand-built, hand-numbered, and assembled with racing tolerances. It was one of the first American cars to use electronic fuel injection, a Bendix system adapted from aerospace technology. In prototype form, the engine was magnificent. It revved freely to over 7,000 RPM and produced nearly 140 horsepower, making it one of the most powerful naturally aspirated 4-cylinders of its day. The sound it made was a mechanical scream, reminiscent of a Formula 2 car, was like nothing else built in Detroit. But the engine's brilliance was also its downfall. By the time the car was ready for production in 1974, new federal emissions laws had changed everything. The EPA demanded extensive testing, and GM's early fuel injection setup couldn't meet the increasingly strict hydrocarbon limits. Engineers scrambled to modify the calibration, but the result was catastrophic. The once 140 horsepower Screamer was strangled down to just 110 horsepower, and its responsiveness evaporated. Even worse, the added catalytic converter made the car run dangerously hot. Some early test cars caught fire during durability runs, and others suffered warped cylinder heads and cracked exhaust manifolds. Cosworth's high-revving masterpiece was suddenly a ticking bomb. The government refused to certify the original fuel system, forcing GM to delay the car's release by almost a full year. Thousands of hand-built engines sat in warehouses, unsellable and slowly oxidizing, while Chevrolet re-engineered the exhaust, ignition, and emissions controls. When the Cosworth Vega finally hit showrooms in 1975, it was a shadow of what it was supposed to be. The engine, though still exotic, ran rough and hot, and the performance was mediocre. 0 to 60 took nearly 9 seconds, slower than many ordinary 6-cylinder sedans. GM tried to market it as a limited production, collector-grade sports sedan, even engraving the production number on each dashboard. Only about 3,500 were planned, but fewer than 2,000 were ever built. The buyers who did take the risk found themselves owning one of the most temperamental American cars of the decade. The electronics were fragile, the aluminum block leaked oil like a sieve, and the high-compression engine demanded premium fuel in an era of rising gas prices. Worst of all, the car's emission systems were so finicky that many Cosworth Vegas failed state inspections outright.
Some owners discovered their engines wouldn't even idle properly without constant adjustment, and the fuel injection computers, primitive by modern standards, often fried themselves in hot weather. One frustrated owner famously told Road and Track, "It's like living with a genius who keeps fainting." Then came the recalls. GM discovered that many early Cosworth Vegas couldn't meet U.S. emission standards even after detuning. Cars were quietly called back to dealerships where mechanics disabled parts of the system or replaced components to force compliance. The government labeled the original setup non-conforming, and the car's reputation collapsed almost overnight. By 1976, the Cosworth Vega was dead, discontinued quietly without ceremony. Most Americans never even saw one. And yet, for all its flaws, the Vega Cosworth remains fascinating. It was a car that tried to bring European precision to American roads, but it collided headfirst with the harsh reality of 1970s regulations and GM's own incompetence. It could have been the car that changed how Americans saw small performance machines. Instead, it became a lesson in what happens when vision outruns technology. Today, collectors view it as a tragic relic, a black and gold time capsule of a company trying to find its soul. The Cosworth Vega's deep metallic paint, gold pinstriping, and intricate valve cover still looks stunning. And when one runs properly, its engine note is mesmerizing. A mechanical song from an era when Detroit still dared to dream. But most never ran right, and few survived long enough to prove what they could have been. In the end, the 1975 Chevrolet Vega Cosworth was banned not because it was evil, but because it was too ambitious for its own time. It was born in the wrong decade, punished for daring to combine racing purity with road legality. What should have been a landmark in American performance engineering became a cautionary tale. The government called it non-compliant. Owners called it cursed. But history remembers it as something in between, a flawed genius, silenced before it could truly sing.
The 1969 Plymouth Roadrunner Superbird prototype Hemi was never meant for ordinary roads, or even for ordinary racing. It was an audacious experiment, a car that blurred the line between automobile and aircraft, conceived in the feverish atmosphere of NASCAR's aerodynamic wars. Before the production Superbird became a legend of late 1960s excess, these prototypes, hand-built, untested, and terrifyingly powerful, pushed the limits of what a car could do on four wheels. What emerged from Chrysler's secret test programs wasn't just too fast for the racetrack, it was too fast for reality itself. At over 180 miles per hour, the pre-production Superbirds became uncontrollable, literally beginning to lift off the ground, defying both gravity and common sense. It all began with the 1969 Daytona 500. Dodge's Charger Daytona had stunned the racing world by breaking the 200-mile-per-hour barrier on the high banks. Plymouth, desperate not to be humiliated by its corporate sibling, demanded a version of its own. The Plymouth division, which had no experience building race cars at that level, was ordered to design a car that would match or beat the Daytona, and to do it in record time. What they produced in secrecy over the summer of 1969 were the earliest prototypes of what would become the 1970 Superbird, raw, unfinished, and terrifyingly potent machines that bore little resemblance to the tamed cars that eventually reached showrooms. Underneath their sheet metal sat Chrysler's most fearsome engine, the race-spec 426 Hemi V8, built to endure the relentless stress of NASCAR superspeedways. These engines weren't detuned or emission-rated. They were pure competition motors, producing more than 575 horsepower, fed by enormous dual four-barrel carburetors and racing exhaust manifolds. The aerodynamic bodywork was fabricated by hand. A sharply tapered nose cone extended nearly 2 feet forward of the original Roadrunner's grille, and a massive rear wing towered over the trunk. The engineers knew the shapes would make the car faster, but no one knew just how unstable they would become at racing speeds. Testing began at Chrysler's Chelsea Proving Grounds in Michigan. On the first full-speed run, test driver Buddy Baker reportedly hit 186 miles per hour before backing off, saying the front end felt light as air. Engineers dismissed his concerns until the second run. At roughly 190 miles per hour, the prototype's front end began to lift, and the car literally started to rise off the pavement. Baker fought the steering, keeping the nose pointed forward as the rear wheels lost traction and the entire car wobbled like a plane in turbulence. He somehow brought it back under control, coasted to a stop, and stepped out shaking. The car's nose panels were vibrating so violently that the headlight housings had cracked. When engineers inspected the underside, they found the front subframe twisted from aerodynamic lift. They reinforced the second prototype and tried again, this time with added ballast in the nose and modified air ducts. It didn't help. At a reported 183 miles per hour, the second car suffered a tire failure caused by aerodynamic load shifts. The shredded tire ripped through the fender, tearing apart the fiberglass nose cone and nearly flipping the vehicle. The engineers were stunned. Their sleek creation had turned into a self-destructive missile. One engineer later remarked, "It wasn't a car anymore. It wanted to fly." Word of the incidents reached NASCAR officials before the testing program even concluded. The sanctioning body was already nervous about the speeds these aero warriors were reaching, as the Daytona had recently cracked 200 miles per hour in competition, speeds the tracks themselves weren't designed for. When NASCAR learned that Plymouth's experimental Superbird was literally becoming airborne, the organization quietly warned Chrysler that any car with such radical modifications would be ruled unsafe for competition. In other words, if they didn't tame it, it would be banned before it ever turned a lap. That changed everything. Plymouth was forced to drastically rework the production version for 1970. The nose angle was softened, the front end reinforced, and the giant rear wing was repositioned for better balance at high speeds. The Hemi engine was detuned to around 425 horsepower for street legality, and extensive testing ensured it could remain grounded under full throttle. But the original pre-production cars, the raw, unfiltered, track-only monsters, were deemed too dangerous to exist. Chrysler ordered all prototypes destroyed. Corporate lawyers didn't want liability, and NASCAR wanted them gone. But as is often the case with legends, one man refused to obey. A Chrysler mechanic named Ray Caldwell, who had worked on the development program, supposedly hid one of the early Hemi Superbird prototypes in a private garage near Highland Park. He had seen what the car could do and couldn't bear to see it scrapped. For years, rumors swirled about a phantom Superbird, a black, unpainted test mule with no VIN, heavier front ballast, and a race-tuned Hemi that could rev to 7,000 RPM. It was said to have been spotted once in the late 1970s, roaring down Woodward Avenue late at night before vanishing again into legend. The production Superbird that followed in 1970 became one of the most iconic muscle cars ever built, its towering wing and long nose instantly recognizable. But few realized that its existence came from a line of prototypes so extreme they nearly killed their test drivers and forced NASCAR to rewrite its rulebook. Those early cars represented the moment when American muscle reached the edge of physics itself. Today, the Superbird prototype Hemi lives on only in whispers, engineering sketches, and a handful of grainy photos taken at the Chelsea track. It remains one of the great what-ifs of American performance history, a machine so fast it broke its own body, so wild it scared NASCAR into rewriting its rulebook, and so rare that only one may have survived, hidden by a man who loved it too much to let it die. It was not just a banned car, but a forbidden experiment in speed, a Plymouth that tried to fly. The 1970 AMC AMX/3 was one of the most extraordinary what-if stories in American automotive history. A car that could have rewritten what people thought American automakers were capable of, yet was stopped before it even began. Conceived by a company known more for Rambler sedans and quirky economy cars than for exotic machinery, the AMX-3 was AMC's bold attempt to prove that it too could build a world-class supercar, one that could outrun Ferraris, outhandle Porsches, and restore pride to an American industry reeling from emissions regulations and fuel concerns. It was fast, fearless, and beautiful, but also reckless, raw, and utterly incompatible with the tightening safety and emissions laws of its time. The story began in the late 1960s, when AMC's image was in trouble. The company had earned a reputation for sensible cars, but lacked the excitement and youth appeal that drove sales for Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler. The success of the AMC AMX, a short-wheelbase two-seater muscle car, had shown that the company could capture attention, but AMC executives wanted something grander, something that would make people forget the word economy and think exotic. Under the leadership of designer Dick Teague, AMC decided to develop a car that would rival the best Europe had to offer, not just in looks, but in engineering and performance. To make that dream real, AMC turned to Italy. They commissioned the legendary Giorgetto Giugiaro, working then for Italdesign, to sketch the body. Giugiaro gave the AMX-3 an unmistakably European silhouette, low-slung, mid-engined, and sculpted with the flowing sensuality of a Ferrari 365 GTB4 Daytona, but with sharper American muscle undertones. It looked like no other AMC before or since, a car that belonged not on Main Street, but on the Autostrada or the Mulsanne Strait. To build it, AMC partnered with the great Giotto Bizzarini, one of the finest automotive engineers of the 20th century, and a man whose fingerprints were on icons like the Ferrari 250 GTO and the Lamborghini Miura chassis. Bizzarini's engineering brilliance transformed AMC's fantasy into a real, drivable prototype. He designed a handmade steel monocoque chassis with a mid-mounted 390 cubic inch AMC V8 producing 340 horsepower. Paired with a ZF 5-speed gearbox, the same used in high-end European sports cars like the De Tomaso Pantera, the AMX-3 could reach 160 miles per hour and handle with precision unmatched by any American car of the era. Its balance was sublime. The mid-engine layout gave it poise, the fully independent suspension made it corner like a race car, and its brakes, steering, and aerodynamics were years ahead of Detroit's norms. During testing at Monza, the AMX-3 achieved 160 miles per hour and proved stable even through high-speed corners, something few muscle cars could dream of. When AMC executives watched the car testing on Italian tracks, they were stunned. Even seasoned European engineers were impressed. Giotto Bizzarini himself said the car could run with the best Ferraris of the time. BMW engineers who consulted on the suspension geometry declared it superior to anything AMC or most American automakers had ever built. The press got wind of the car, and Car and Driver published photos of the prototype, calling it the most beautiful American car since the Corvette Stingray. For a moment, it seemed AMC had done the impossible, an American exotic, hand-built in Italy, faster than anything from Detroit. But in the background, trouble was brewing. The very qualities that made the AMX-3 a masterpiece, its handmade construction, mid-engine layout, and European manufacturing, were exactly what made it impossible to sell in the United States. By 1970, new federal safety and emission standards were coming into effect, and they spelled doom for low-production supercars. The AMX-3's exposed carburetors vented raw fuel fumes into the air before it even crossed the Atlantic. Its chassis, though stiff and precise, had zero crush zones or safety reinforcements required under new regulations. There were no energy-absorbing bumpers, no standardized lighting, and no certified impact testing. To U.S. regulators, the car was a death trap waiting to happen, a gorgeous missile made of steel and ambition. The government didn't just make it difficult, they made it impossible. U.S. safety authorities refused to certify the car for importation.
AMC's leadership, already struggling financially, couldn't afford to modify the design to meet the new rules or to build the tooling needed for production. The idea of building it domestically was floated, but it was quickly dismissed as unrealistic. The AMX/3's chassis was so intricate that even experienced Italian craftsmen found it difficult to weld correctly. Each example took weeks to assemble by hand, and the cost per unit was astronomical, roughly 3 times that of a new Corvette. Only 5 cars were completed, each subtly different from the others, with bodies built by Italian coach builders like Salvatore Diamante and Bizzarini himself. They were finished in rich European colors, deep reds, metallic blues, and silver, and each carried the quiet heartbreak of what could have been. When AMC shipped one to the United States for promotional purposes, customs officials refused to release it without costly safety modifications. The company, seeing no future for the project, quietly canceled it and turned its attention back to bread-and-butter models like the Gremlin and Hornet. The AMX/3 vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Over the decades, the 5 surviving AMX/3s became almost mythical. Collectors whispered about their origins, a Detroit dream born in Modena, too beautiful and too dangerous to be legal. Jay Leno once called it the American Miura that never was. One of the original prototypes, chassis number 4, surfaced in the 1990s and was fully restored, revealing just how advanced the car really was. It could still outhandle most modern muscle cars, and its build quality, though delicate, reflected the kind of craftsmanship that Detroit could never replicate at scale. In the end, the AMX/3 was banned not for what it did wrong, but for what it dared to do right at the wrong time. It was a car born on the threshold between eras, a symbol of unbridled creativity, just as regulation and caution began to rule the automotive world. It stood for a dream that AMC, of all companies, dared to chase, that even the smallest, most underestimated American automaker could build something to rival Ferrari. But the dream collided with reality, and reality won. Today, when one of the 5 surviving AMX/3s appears at a concours or private collection, people stare in disbelief. The car looks like something from an alternate timeline, a glimpse into a world where America didn't just build muscle cars, but true exotics. It's a ghost from a moment when AMC reached for greatness, touched it, and then watched it slip away, banned by a government that couldn't imagine something so wild wearing an American badge. The 1969 Chevrolet Impala SS427 L72 was one of the strangest, most dangerous contradictions in American automotive history. A car that looked like a family cruiser, but moved like a runaway freight train. It was the ultimate case of corporate schizophrenia. A company known for safe, suburban sedans, quietly offering an engine so violent that it belonged in a race car. On paper, it was a simple option. Check the right boxes on your order form, and your full-size Chevrolet could come alive with the same 425 horsepower L72 big block V8 that powered COPO Camaros and Corvette drag monsters. But in reality, what rolled out of the factory gates was something that shouldn't have existed at all. A 4,000-pound family sedan that could outrun police interceptors, shatter tires in second gear, and push its drum brakes to the point of mechanical suicide. It was a product of horsepower madness, and regulators didn't take kindly to it. To understand the L72 Impala, you have to remember the time. By 1969, Detroit was in the throes of its most intoxicating horsepower war. Chevrolet had already armed its Chevelles, Camaros, and Novas with ferocious big block engines, but the company's engineers, always eager to go one step further, wanted to prove that even a full-size family car could deliver supercar performance. The idea was almost absurd. Take the massive B-body Impala, a car better suited for cross-country drives with luggage and kids, and turn it into a secret weapon for those who wanted speed without the flashy looks of a muscle car. The result was the SS427, and when ordered with the optional L72 engine, it became one of the most fearsome sleepers of the decade. The L72 itself was an engine born out of racing. It was a 427 cubic inch big block V8 with solid lifters, high-flow rectangular port heads, a forged steel crankshaft, and 11.1-to-1 compression. Officially rated at 425 horsepower, most experts, and anyone who drove one, knew that the real figure was closer to 470 or even 500. This was the same power plant that powered factory drag cars like the COPO Camaro and the Corvette L72, capable of quarter-mile times deep into the 13s and trap speeds around 110 miles per hour, astonishing for the era. In the lightweight Camaro, it was terrifying. In the 2-ton Impala, it was downright suicidal. Inside the Impala SS 427, everything looked ordinary. Vinyl seats, chrome trim, even air conditioning if you wanted it. But under the hood lurked a monster that turned a peaceful family car into a land-bound missile. With its immense torque, the car could burn through its rear tires with the slightest provocation. Contemporary road tests from Hot Rod and Car Life reported 0 to 60 times in the 5-second range. Absurd for a full-size sedan in 1969. Top speed was around 140 to 145 miles per hour, though no official test dared to confirm it. Few were willing to push a 4,000-pound car with drum brakes and a live rear axle that fast. When one test driver did, he described the experience as like trying to steer a brick through a hurricane. And that's where the trouble began. The L72 Impala might have been blindingly fast, but it was catastrophically underbuilt for its own speed. Chevrolet had not upgraded the car's suspension or braking system to handle the enormous power. It still used drum brakes on all 4 corners, and even with optional heavy-duty linings, fade set in after one hard stop from high speed. Steering was vague and slow, the front end floated under acceleration, and the chassis flexed alarmingly when cornering. Several states began to raise concerns about licensing such vehicles for public use. Reports circulated of Impalas that lost control during highway tests, and some insurance agencies outright refused to cover them. Dealers, too, began to panic. Customers who expected a luxury cruiser were returning cars after discovering that their big Chevy idled like a dragster and shook at traffic lights. The L72's solid-lift valve train demanded constant adjustment, and its high compression required premium fuel that few gas stations reliably provided. Chevrolet issued internal memos reminding dealers to warn customers about the car's quietly offering an engine so violent that it belonged in a race car. Eventually, the controversy grew large enough that certain state inspectors began refusing to certify the L72-equipped Impalas for highway registration. Massachusetts and California were among the first to raise red flags, citing emissions non-compliance and braking deficiencies. Some dealers were instructed to include disclaimers noting that the car was intended for off-highway or competition use. Chevrolet, realizing that its family-friendly image was at risk, quickly pulled the L72 option from the Impala lineup. In total, fewer than 1,500 cars were built with the 425-horsepower L72 engine, and many of those were quietly detuned or retrofitted with milder power plants before sale. For those who managed to buy one before the clampdown, the experience was unforgettable. One owner, interviewed decades later, recalled, "It was like having a bomb under the hood. You could cruise like any regular Impala, but the moment you hit the throttle, the world blurred. The front end lifted, and suddenly you were somewhere between terror and ecstasy." Another said, "It looked like my dad's car, but it drove like something out of a nightmare." In the years that followed, the L72 Impala became an underground legend, the ultimate sleeper, a car that embodied the insanity of the late muscle era just before the government and insurance companies slammed the door shut. It was a reminder of a time when automakers cared less about safety and sanity and more about sheer unfiltered horsepower. But its fall down also marked the beginning of a reckoning. The idea that a full-size sedan could be fitted with race-ready equipment without adequate safety systems became a cautionary tale within General Motors. By the early 1970s, as emission standards tightened and horsepower ratings fell, the L72 was gone.
In its place came detuned, emission-controlled engines that barely made half the power. The era of the street-legal missile had ended. The Impala returned to its role as a comfortable cruiser, leaving behind only whispers of the time it nearly became one of the most dangerous family cars in America. Today, surviving L72 Impalas are among the rarest Chevrolets ever built. Most people don't even know they existed. To the untrained eye, they look like any other late 1960s Impala, long, elegant, and unassuming. But those who know the secret understand what lurks beneath. The heart of a drag racer trapped inside a Sunday sedan. It was too powerful for the roads, too fast for its brakes, and too reckless for its own time. A machine so wild that even Chevrolet had to admit defeat. The Impala SS 427 L72 remains a forgotten monster from the last days of unchecked horsepower, a full-size testament to the madness that defined the muscle car era.
The 1971 Ford Mustang Mach 1 Super Cobra Jet 429 was, in many ways, the last untamed roar of Detroit before the long silence that followed. It arrived at a time when the golden age of muscle cars was collapsing under the weight of politics, insurance rates, and a suddenly cautious public. But for one brief, furious moment, Ford ignored the storm clouds on the horizon and built a machine so violent, so defiantly excessive, that it felt like a declaration of war against the very idea of restraint. The Mach 1 SCJ wasn't just a car. It was Detroit's last stand before emissions laws, safety mandates, and fuel crises forced the muscle car to kneel. To understand what made the Super Cobra Jet so significant, you have to see where Ford was in 1971. The Mustang had grown larger and heavier to accommodate new crash regulations and customer demands for luxury. It wasn't the lithe pony car of 1965 anymore. It was a brute, longer, wider, and nearly 3,700 pounds in top trim. Most automakers responded to this era of change by detuning engines, prioritizing comfort, and quietly preparing for the emissions limits that would take full effect in 1972. Ford, however, decided to give one final gift to those who still believed in unfiltered horsepower. That gift was the 429 Super Cobra Jet. The SCJ was no ordinary big block. Beneath the scooped hood of the Mach 1 sat a monstrous 429 cubic inch V8 with a 4-bolt main block, forged pistons, solid lifter camshaft, massive ports, and a Holley 4-barrel carburetor the size of a coffee pot. Officially rated at 375 horsepower, the true figure was well north of 420, and torque exceeded 450 pound-feet. This was the same basic power plant that had powered Ford's NASCAR program just a year earlier, tamed only slightly for street use. Its deep, hammering idle was unmistakable, a low, mechanical thunder that sent shivers through anyone within earshot. But this wasn't just an engine, it was an act of rebellion. By 1971, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, was enforcing new emissions and noise standards that made engines like the SCJ nearly impossible to certify. Ford's own engineers knew it was doomed. One insider famously remarked, "You couldn't pass emissions with this engine unless you removed the pistons." The Super Cobra Jet was simply too aggressive, too dirty, and too loud. Its compression ratio was 11.3 to 1. It drank premium leaded gasoline by the gallon, and it spewed hydrocarbons like a small refinery. It was the opposite of everything the government and the insurance industry wanted cars to be. That didn't stop Ford from building a few. In fact, the company did everything it could to sneak them past regulators, limiting production and marketing them primarily as track-oriented options. The SCJ package included a 3.91 or 4.11 rear axle with a drag pack oil cooler, heavy-duty connecting rods, and a close-ratio top-loader 4-speed transmission. On the drag strip, it was brutally effective. A properly tuned example could hit 60 miles per hour in under 6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-13s, astonishing for a car of its size. But it was also completely unmanageable in traffic.
The clutch was heavy, the idle unstable, and the fuel economy laughable. At full throttle, the 429 could burn through its entire tank in less than 100 miles. Emissions inspectors were not amused. The SCJ's carburation and ignition systems couldn't meet new hydrocarbon and carbon monoxide limits even in factory tune. The car also failed noise tests due to its unmuffled exhaust and the violent backfire that occurred during deceleration. Ford's own certification engineers admitted there was no way to civilize it without killing what made it special. As the 1972 model year approached, with the Clean Air Act in full effect, Ford had no choice but to pull the plug. Production of the Super Cobra jet ended abruptly, and by 1972, the once mighty 429 was replaced by the much milder 351 Cleveland, a sad, neutered echo of what had come before. For the few who managed to buy one before the ban, the Mach 1 SCJ was both a privilege and a curse. Owners quickly discovered that the car was practically allergic to low speeds. One driver recalled, "It didn't idle, it shook, coughed, and demanded attention. It felt like a caged animal that wanted to kill something." Another owner, a former drag racer, said, "It wasn't a car for cruising. It was a car for scaring everyone else at the stoplight." On the open road, the SCJ was magnificent, a tidal wave of torque that could make even a 4,000-pound Mustang feel like a lightweight. But in city traffic, it overheated, fouled plugs, and drank fuel so quickly that owners joked about carrying jerry cans in the trunk. The government's clampdown in 1972 ended any hope of the SCJ returning. By then, horsepower ratings were measured using net rather than gross output, and the numbers plummeted overnight. The once feared 429 was gone, and the muscle car age was officially over. For Ford, the Mach 1 Super Cobra jet became a whispered legend, a car that represented everything both glorious and reckless about the late 1960s horsepower war. It was a machine built without compromise, without concern for practicality, and without fear of authority. And for that very reason, it could not survive in the new America that followed. Today, the few surviving 1971 Mach 1 SCJs are among the most coveted and misunderstood muscle cars ever built. They don't have the fame of Boss 429s or the sleekness of early Shelbys, but to purists, they represent the very last moment before the lights went out. They are cars that embodied defiance, fire-breathing dinosaurs roaring against extinction. When one starts up, the ground still shakes, and you can almost hear the echo of an era dying with it. The 1971 Mustang Mach 1 Super Cobra jet wasn't banned because it was unsafe or unreliable. It was banned because it was honest. It refused to pretend to be efficient, clean, or tame. It was Detroit's middle finger to regulation, a monument to mechanical excess, and a farewell salute to a time when power mattered more than politics. In the cold light of the 1970s, it was a dinosaur. But in the hearts of those who remember the muscle era, it remains something far greater, the last true beast to roar before the silence.
The 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona 500 Hemi prototype is not merely a footnote in automotive history. It is one of the most extreme, audacious, and perilously ambitious experiments ever undertaken in the American muscle car era. These prototypes were born at the peak of the late 1960s horsepower wars, when Detroit engineers were locked in an all-out arms race for dominance on the NASCAR superspeedways. Dodge's goal was simple in theory, yet almost impossible in practice. Create a car so fast, so aerodynamic, and so uncompromisingly efficient that it could leave competitors like the Ford Torino Talladega and Plymouth Superbird choking on its dust. In reality, the 500 Hemi prototypes became a living lesson in the dangers of pushing engineering beyond the limits of physics, a cautionary tale of ambition outrunning practicality, and a near disaster waiting to happen. The Charger Daytona's transformation from a conventional muscle car to a NASCAR legend began with radical aerodynamics. Dodge engineers recognized that the standard Charger body, while competitive, was insufficient for the high-speed demands of the superspeedways. To overcome the challenge, they designed a dramatically elongated nose cone, tapering into a razor point that could slice through air with minimal drag, paired with a towering rear wing meant to generate downforce and stabilize the car at extreme velocities. On paper, the concept was pure genius, a car that would dominate on the track with minimal wind resistance and maximum traction. In practice, however, the design nearly proved fatal. The aerodynamics, for all their brilliance, were not inherently safe for street or even controlled track use. Test drivers quickly discovered that the pointed nose, while reducing drag, made the front end unnervingly light at high speeds. The car, weighing over 3,600 pounds, could lift slightly off the ground when reaching velocities around 170 to 180 miles per hour, creating an almost uncontrollable sense of flight. Pair this with the unbridled power of the 426 cubic inch Hemi V8, a monster of torque and horsepower, capable of flinging the car forward with frightening force, and the Daytona became less a vehicle and more a guided missile with a mind of its own. Engineers and drivers alike soon realized that this car had no tolerance for mistakes, and that even a minor misjudgment could easily end in disaster. The danger was not hypothetical. During testing, multiple drivers came perilously close to catastrophe. One veteran recounted the terrifying moment when, mid-lap, the front wheels seemed to lose all connection with the asphalt. "I literally had to ease off and pray the car didn't flip," he said. Another described the sensation as piloting a beast that refused to follow the rules of physics, a car that demanded absolute reverence or it would kill you. The repeated near accidents left engineers with no choice. The pre-production 500 Hemi prototypes were fundamentally unfit for either racetrack or public roads. Immediate corrective work on suspension geometry, weight distribution, and chassis rigidity was attempted, but the danger had already left an indelible mark on the prototype's legacy. Federal authorities, alerted to the severity of the instability, acted decisively. In an unusual move for the time, when automakers often ignored safety warnings in pursuit of speed, Chrysler ordered the pre-production 500 Hemi prototypes recalled and crushed. Unlike other banned vehicles of the era, these cars were not outlawed because of emissions regulations, noise ordinances, or bureaucratic red tape. They were banned because they defied the most fundamental rules of automotive physics. The combination of extreme aerodynamics, towering power, and improper weight balance created a car that simply could not survive on asphalt without posing a grave risk to human life. Yet the tragedy of these pre-production models carried a hidden benefit. Lessons learned from their extreme failures directly informed the development of the production Charger Daytona. Engineers adjusted the nose angle, reworked the suspension, strengthened the chassis, and lowered the car's center of gravity, producing a machine capable of dominating NASCAR without courting immediate disaster. The production Daytona would go on to break records, famously being the first stock car to exceed 200 miles per hour on the track, cementing Dodge's legacy as a manufacturer willing to innovate, take risks, and redefine what a muscle car could be. Despite the production success, the 500 Hemi prototypes remain shrouded in near-mythical status. Collectors, historians, and enthusiasts speak with them with reverence, often whispering about the cars that almost flew, almost killed, and almost changed racing history forever. Only a few photographs, documents, and anecdotal accounts survive. The prototypes themselves were destroyed, crushed under federal orders, leaving their legend alive only in stories and imagination. Unlike many forbidden cars of the era, the Daytona prototypes were outlawed not by legislation, but by the immutable, unforgiving rules of physics. Today, the Dodge Charger Daytona stands as a symbol of ambition, ingenuity, and sometimes dangerous pursuit of perfection. Its massive rear wing and elongated nose remain iconic in the world of automotive culture, immortalized in posters, die-cast models, and countless replications. But it is the Phantom 500 Hemi prototypes that continue to capture the imagination. Cars that were too fast, too aerodynamic, and too lethal to exist outside of controlled experimentation. Vehicles that were literally banned by reality itself.
They remind us that the pursuit of speed carries inherent risk, that innovation without caution can produce machines more lethal than anyone imagined, and that in the late 1960s, muscle cars weren't just about performance. They were about flirting with the edge of death. The 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona 500 Hemi prototype was more than a car. It was a perfect storm of ambition, physics, and engineering excess, a machine that proved how close the line is between legendary performance and fatal disaster. Its story survives as both a warning and a testament, a car banned not by law but by nature itself, a fleeting glimpse of unrestrained American muscle at its most raw, most brilliant, and most terrifying.
The 1970 Pontiac GTO Judge Ram Air 4 stands as one of the most extreme statements of American muscle car audacity. A car built not just to impress, but to dominate, to intimidate, and to challenge every rule that had been imposed on street vehicles by the dawn of the 1970s. At a time when automakers were already beginning to feel the tightening grip of emissions legislation, safety standards, and insurance pressures, Pontiac chose to push forward with a creation that was essentially a street-legal dragster in disguise. A car so hot, so loud, and so unrelenting that many states simply refused to tolerate it. It was not just a car, it was a statement, a dare, and a fleeting icon of unfiltered performance that existed in the liminal space between legality and legend. Under the hood of the Judge lurked the heart of a small block monster. Pontiac's Ram Air 4 400 cubic inch V8, featuring a staggering 10.75-to-1 compression ratio, a high-performance camshaft, and Pontiac's unique Ram Air induction system. The engine didn't just breathe, it inhaled with fury, forcing cold, dense air through large, precision-porting intake runners, maximizing combustion efficiency at the high RPMs the engine loved. Its 4-barrel carburetor demanded constant attention and premium fuel, while the cylinder heads, push rods, and valve springs were all built for high-speed performance that ordinary daily drivers could never hope to exploit. Yet this relentless engineering also brought serious consequences for the street. Idling was erratic, low-speed drivability was difficult, and the engine emitted smoke, unburned hydrocarbons, and a sound that was considered dangerously loud in many municipalities. Regulatory authorities quickly noticed. In several states, the combination of extreme noise and toxic emissions rendered the Ram Air 4 Judge non-compliant. Some state inspectors refused to certify the car for sale entirely, while others demanded unofficial workarounds. Pontiac dealers, unwilling to lose sales, quietly began swapping engines or detuning cars to meet local laws, but such modifications robbed the vehicle of its ferocious potential. For buyers, this meant that while a few of the cars retained their full-bore power, many Judge models were neutered before they even left the dealership lot, creating a strange, almost clandestine marketplace of high-performance legality. By the end of the year, in many areas, the Judge had disappeared as swiftly as it had appeared, a literal outlaw car that vanished overnight before the sheriff could arrive. Pontiac never issued a formal recall, yet the effect was the same. The Ram Air 4 was banned not by statute, but by circumstance, a casualty of its own intensity. On the rare occasions when a Ram Air 4-equipped Judge survived intact, it offered an experience unlike any other muscle car of its era. Drivers spoke of a launch that could pin you to the seat with heart-stopping force, of the engine's roar vibrating through the chassis, of quarter-mile times that rivaled dedicated drag racers. The exhaust note, a symphony of backfires, pops, and mechanical growls, became as iconic as the car's flamboyant styling, an audible declaration of defiance. But the car demanded respect. A heavy right foot could overheat the engine or cause mechanical failures. Low-speed traffic maneuvers were treacherous due to erratic idling and the high-strung nature of the drivetrain. This was a car that rewarded skill but punished the inattentive, a rare street machine that could feel dangerous simply because it was engineered without compromise.
The GTO Judge Ram Air 4 also represented the last gasp of the classic American muscle era in many ways. The environmental regulations of the 1970s, along with rising insurance costs and corporate caution, were beginning to suffocate high-compression, naturally aspirated engines. Whereas the Big Three had spent the late 1960s in a horsepower war, Pontiac's Judge was one of the last pure examples of what that war had produced. A car that existed first and foremost to go fast, to thrill, and to dominate, with scant regard for emissions, safety, or practicality. In a very real sense, every Ram Air 4 Judge that vanished from showrooms was a casualty of a changing world, a symbol of the end of an era where raw power was king and regulations were only beginning to intervene. Today, the surviving Ram Air 4 Judges are coveted beyond measure. They are not only machines of speed and engineering excellence, but also relics of a fleeting moment in time when car makers could build an almost untamed street fighter and deliver it to the public, if only briefly. Historians and collectors describe the Ram Air 4 Judge as simultaneously exhilarating and cursed. A car that thrilled and terrified, that demanded skill and attention, and that existed in a legal gray zone where few dare tread. Its legendary status is amplified precisely because so many were quietly neutered, restricted, or banned outright, leaving behind only stories, photos, and the rare survivors. The 1970 Pontiac GTO Judge Ram Air 4 was in essence a perfect storm of engineering ambition, government overreach, and raw, unfiltered muscle car power. It was banned, it was feared, and disappeared almost as quickly as it was born. Yet in the hearts of enthusiasts, it roars on. It stands as a monument to excess, a celebration of performance, and a haunting reminder that sometimes speed and ambition will always outrun the law. The Ram Air 4 Judge wasn't just a car. It was the untamed spirit of American muscle distilled into metal, chrome, and fire.
The 1971 Chevrolet Corvette ZR2, forever whispered among collectors and muscle car historians as the Beast, is one of the most secretive, extreme, and almost mythical chapters in the annals of American automotive history. Unlike any Corvette that came before it, the ZR2 was a prototype of unrestrained ambition, a machine that existed in defiance of practical reason, regulatory oversight, and even basic drivability. Conceived during the peak of Detroit's late 1960s horsepower wars, when manufacturers were locked in an escalating contest for street and track dominance, the ZR2 was Chevrolet's clandestine answer to the growing power of Ford, Pontiac, and Dodge, a car built not for comfort, safety, or emissions compliance, but purely for raw, untamed speed and sheer mechanical audacity. At its heart lay a colossal LS6 454 cubic inch V8, hand-assembled and tuned to produce nearly 500 horsepower, well beyond the officially rated 450 horsepower of the standard LS6 Corvette. The engine was a marvel of brute engineering. Forged pistons, reinforced crankshaft, aggressive camshaft profile, and an all but uncontrollable torque curve. Every test revealed a machine of frightening capability. Its raw power was enough to shred transmissions that were otherwise considered robust, and the rear tires frequently lost grip under acceleration, sometimes unpredictably, creating a vehicle that could easily spin, fishtail, or worse, lift partially off the ground under the wrong conditions. Engineers quickly realized that while the car was theoretically drivable, it was barely controllable even in controlled test environments. Mechanical failures became the norm during initial testing. The ZR2 overheated with alarming regularity. Cooling systems designed for the already potent LS6 were insufficient for the engine's extreme output. Transmissions, even those reinforced for durability, shredded themselves under the unrelenting torque, often mid-session, leaving cars stranded on test tracks. The suspension, tuned for maximum high-speed stability, made city or suburban driving punishing and unpredictable.
Every throttle input demanded precision, and even minor lapses could send the rear end stepping out violently. Drivers reported that the ZR2 was almost alive, a mechanical predator that demanded respect and absolute concentration. These engineering marvels collided head-on with regulatory reality. When Chevrolet attempted to certify the ZR2 for sale in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency refused outright. The engine produced far too many emissions, both in hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide, to meet the 1971 standards, and attempts to detune or adjust the fuel system rendered the car meaningless. A Corvette without its extreme power was just another standard Corvette. The ZR2's emissions, combined with the car's untamable handling, made it a legal and practical impossibility. In the end, Chevrolet quietly terminated the program, abandoning the prototypes and effectively erasing them from official records. Unlike other high-performance projects of the era, the ZR2 was never displayed, never advertised, and never sold. A ghost Corvette, existing only in internal documents, photographs, and whispered anecdotes. Only a handful of these cars were ever built, and even fewer survived the subsequent years. Those that did became almost sacred artifacts, coveted by collectors for their rarity and whispered legend. The ZR2 is remembered not merely as a car, but as an embodiment of what happens when engineering ambition is allowed to run unchecked by practicality or law. It is a vehicle that could out-accelerate, out-handle, and outgun nearly anything of its time, if it could be driven without disaster. Its combination of power, fragility, and volatility rendered it more dangerous than it was fast, and yet that danger is precisely what has cemented its status among the most forbidden, enigmatic, and revered Corvettes ever conceived. The story of the ZR2 also illuminates a turning point in American muscle car culture. It exists as a stark reminder that the late 1960s horsepower wars were not merely about bragging rights or showroom glory, but about pushing engineering to the very edge of what human and mechanical limits would allow. It was a machine unfit for public roads, unfit for certification, unfit for moderation, and that, paradoxically, made it the purest expression of what a Corvette could be at its most extreme. Collectors, enthusiasts, and former engineers still speak of the ZR2 in hushed tones, recounting stories of engines that roared like beasts, transmissions that disintegrated under strain, and handling that demanded near superhuman reflexes. The surviving cars are some of the rarest Corvettes in existence, locked in private collections, museum displays, or hidden behind velvet ropes at concourse events. They are tangible reminders of a car that never officially existed, a Corvette that was banned not by politics, not by morality, but by the simple, unyielding limits of reality. Ultimately, the 1971 Chevrolet Corvette ZR2, the Beast, is more than a car. It is a symbol. It is a testament to raw ambition, reckless genius, and the dangerous thrill of unbridled mechanical power. It is the Corvette that could have dominated all others, if only the world and its own engineering were ready. It was too fast, too powerful, too volatile, and too extreme to survive outside the controlled chaos of a test track. It was, in every sense, a forbidden legend. The Corvette that never should have been, yet never will be forgotten. Its tale is whispered among enthusiasts as a warning, a myth, and a dream, the ultimate example of automotive ambition unchained, now frozen forever in the rarest corners of Corvette history.